Use the following conditional statement to determine your responses. If I get paid today, then I will take you to the movies. Notice the statement has two key parts. The if part is going to be what they call the hypothesis. So your hypothesis is going to be your if. The then part is going to be your conclusion. Write the conditional statement below. Underline the hypothesis with one line. Do not include the word if, and underline the conclusion with two lines. Do not include the word then. And I'm not going to have you rewrite this because they have it written up here. What I want you to do is just underline the hypothesis once and underline your conclusion twice. So the if part is going to be the hypothesis, the then part will be your conclusion. Problem number 2. Recall from the previous lesson that if a statement is true, then its opposite is false. Assuming the hypothesis in the above statement is true, what condition would make the hypothesis false? Okay, for your hypothesis to be false, this is your hypothesis, it would be if you did not get paid today. So we're going to say false if you did not get paid. Assuming the conclusion of the above statement is true, what condition would make the conclusion false? The conclusion will be false if you didn't go to the movies. Right, conditional statements summary, the next part. A conditional statement consists of a hypothesis and a conclusion. So you need to write the word hypothesis here. And the word conclusion here. The hypothesis is the if. The conclusion will be the then. And if you'll look, this on my hanging from my ceiling, I have a ghost that says if-then statement. That's also a conditional statement. So these will be coming back. You'll be seeing a lot of these. Your conditional statement is an if-then statement. A conditional statement is false if the hypothesis is blank and the conclusion is blank. So a conditional statement is false if the hypothesis is true and the conclusion is false. A counterexample is any case that shows the conditional to be false. What would be the counterexample of the movie situation? A counterexample of the movie situation is where you get paid but do not go to the movies. So that would be where the hypothesis is true, you get paid, but you do not go to the movies. Given the two statements, P and Q, if P then Q can be written as Q is P or P implies Q. The conditional truth table, if P then Q. Okay, so we're looking at the hypothesis and the conclusion, and I'm going to go back to their example of getting paid and going to the movies. So if both are true, if you get paid and you go to the movies, if that's true, then the whole statement is true. If you get paid but don't go to the movies, that's going to be false. This is kind of like the and. if I get paid and I'll go to the movies, so this is real similar to those and statements we had. If the hypothesis is false, I didn't get paid, but I went to the movies. So if P, then Q, that's going to be false. And if they're both false, then it's false. So this is like the and statements. Number 3, consider the conditional statement. If you live in the United States, then you live in Texas. What is the hypothesis? Remember, your hypothesis is the if part. So your hypothesis would be if you live in the U.S. The conclusion would be you live in Texas. All right, moving on to part C of number 3. Is the conditional statement true or false? How do you know? Provide a counterexample if it is false. All right, if you live in the United States, do you live in Texas? Is that true? Because Texas is in the United States, it's going to be true. How do you know? You know because Texas is in the United States. Rewrite the conditional in QP if form. So they want you to make it an if-then statement. If you live in the United States, then you live in Texas. Rewrite the conditional statement in P implies Q. So they want you to turn it around. They want you to put the hypothesis last and the conclusion first. So they want you to say, if you live in Texas, then it implies you live in the U.S. Consider the statement, if you live in the United States, then you live in Texas. Write a conditional statement using the phrase, you live in Texas and you live in the United States, that is similar to the one above, but that is true. So I want you to write an if-then statement and to make it true. If you live in the United States, then you live in Texas. Well, that's not necessarily true because you can live in another state. So we need to make sure that we say, if you live in Texas, you live in the United States. How's your statement different from the original? Well, the original statement they had here, we had to change. We had to put the conclusion first and the hypothesis last. So we wrote conclusion first. Why did you change the terms of the hypothesis and the conclusion? Because you could live in another state. So if you live in the United States, you don't have to live in Texas. When the hypothesis and the conclusion are switched, the resulting conditional statement is called the converse. Go back to the original statement. If you live in the United States, then you live in Texas. What is the negation of opposite meaning of the hypothesis? The opposite meaning would be if you don't live in the U.S., then you don't live in Texas. What is the negation of the conclusion? You don't live in Texas. Rewrite the original statement using the negation of the original hypothesis and the new hypothesis and the negation of the conclusion as the new conclusion. And that's what we did up here. If you don't live in the U.S., then you don't live in Texas. So I'm just going to draw an arrow because we already wrote that for number 7. When you negated both the hypothesis and the conclusion, the resulting conditional statement is called inverse of the original statement. Is the inverse statement true or false? In this case, if you don't live in the U.S., you don't live in Texas. In this case, it's true. Go back to the original statement. If you live in the U.S., then you live in Texas. Rewrite the original statement using the negation of both the hypothesis and conclusion and switch their positions. So they want you to say, if you don't live in Texas, you don't live in the U.S. When you negated both the hypothesis and the conclusion and switched their positions, the resulting conditional statement is called the contrapositive of the original statement. Is the contrapositive statement true or false? All right, so your contrapositive will be true. And we are going to go in more detail on the converse, inverse, and contrapositive on the next set of notes. So if this is a little confusing right now, that's okay. You're going to see this again and in more detail. On one condition, refer back to the previous exercises. Summarize below how to construct the converse, inverse, and contrapositive of a given conditional statement. So what we're going to do here is actually get the definition. Your converse is where you switch your if and then. For example, they said if you live in the U.S., then you live in Texas. To swap that around, you would say if you live in Texas, then you live in the U.S. That's your converse. Inverse is where you add the word not. If you do not live in the U.S., then you do not live in Texas. That's inverse. Contrapositive is where you do both converse and inverse. So you swap them around and add the word not. That's what contrapositive is. Given the conditional statement, if you play football, then you are an athlete. Use the table below to find the related statements and the truth value of each. So your conditional statement is, if you play football, then you are an athlete. If it's true, you do not need a counterexample. You only need counterexamples when it's false. The converse of that, if you are an athlete, then you play football. Is this going to be true or false? If you're an athlete, then you play football. If you're an athlete, can you play other sports? Because you can be an athlete and play other sports, this is false. So our counterexample is, can play other sports. Inverse, that's where you add the word not. If you do not play football, then you are not an athlete. So is this one going to be true or false? It says, if you do not play football, then you are not an athlete. Well, this is going to be false because you could play basketball and still be an athlete. So our counterexample is going to be, could play basketball. Your contrapositive is where you do both, the converse and the inverse. So it would be, if you are not an athlete, then you do not play football. Positive. If you are not an athlete, then you do not play football. And this one's going to be true. What relationships are observed between the conditional statement and their true-false values? All right, look at your conditional statement. Your converse and your inverse were false. Your contrapositive was true. So when your conditional is true, contrapositive is true. And when the conditional is true, the converse and the inverse are false.